flavored on the palate, with a fiery kick that didn't register properly until it was well down the throat.
The bar was filled with bones. Must have been the best parts of 10 to 15 people all jumbled in the joint. Some was women. Remains of some fancy shoes in among the ribs and skulls.
What's that, Finn? Bones all jumbled up?
Yeah.
And someone had been in that part?
Finnegan considered the question and took another sip of the brandy.
Got to be right. Fucking right. Only place in this gaudy that the chills have been moved at all. Yeah. Looked like some bottles were gone. Gaps on shelves.
It was late afternoon. The sun that had shone so boldly through the morning had vanished, drifting away under a leaden gray cloud cover. Through chinks in the faded drapes, the lights from the flashlights flickered and danced. They could be seen outside, across the waterways. They could be seen by the crouching figure in ragged leather breeches and jerkin, a figure with eyes like fire and hair white as snow. The razor edge of the dagger methodically chopped and cut the crystalline powder. The chopping made it as fine as ground flour, separating it into narrow lines no thicker than a stalk of wheat, no longer than a man's middle finger. The surface of the mirror was dulled and scored with 1,000 tiny scratches from years of use. It was an artifact that predated the short war, brought in by one of the sec patrols, handed first to the sec boss, then on to the Baron himself. The drug, a powerful hallucinogenic mixture of cocaine, heroin, and mescaline, had been brought by Swampwag to the Baron's headquarters from a tumble-down dock a few miles from Baton Rouge. It had been part of a shipment carried by a battered clipper ship from Trinidad. Its country of origin had once been called Colombia, but now had no name at all. The Baron knelt beside the glass-topped table, his legs stuck awkwardly behind him, his great head lowered over the mirror. In his right hand he held a thin tube of beaten gold, made for him deep in the swamps by one of the living dead, who had an unusual skill with metals. The tube traveled slowly along the line of the drug, known as jolt, from its sudden and strong effect on users. Baron Tourmont snorted at it, the powder disappearing as the tube went along one line, then down the next, taking 4 lines in total. Immediately shutting his eyes, holding his face between his 2 huge hands, he waited for the rush. In the whole of Deathlands, it was doubtful that there was a single man of science with the pharmacological knowledge to understand how jolt worked, but its effects were always the same. A kick of pain speared through the Baron's sinuses, bursting behind his eyes. His head shook uncontrollably, rolling from side to side. He tried to keep his eyes squeezed shut, but the force of the spasm jammed them open, the pupils rolling sightlessly. After the first spasm of pain, the drug moved differently, attacking the cortex, closing down on the short-term memory of the frontal lobes. The power of a shot of jolt lasted from 3 to 5 minutes, depending on its purity and on the strength of the user. Baron Tourmont could afford to pay for the best, but his giant body absorbed the drug too fast for his own pleasure. Its effects rarely lasted for more than about 3.5 minutes. But what a 200 seconds they were. A tumbling passage through time and memory and imagination, into scenes of desolation and horror. Scenes of horrific violence that made the giant black man press his fingers against his swelling erection. The guards outside the door shuddered and glanced fearfully at each other. When the Baron was jolting, his mood was even less predictable than usual. The sec man who once entered at the wrong moment had been taken out, clutching his own spilled intestines. The Baron had laughed then. But Tourmont used the jolt for one special reason. In the last 30 seconds or so, it clouded the mind, and a form of madness followed. The Baron was the 7th son of a 7th daughter, and had always had a little of the power of seeing. As the jolt worked its way into the abandoned corridors of the mind, it sometimes increased his precognition, his powers of doom-seeing. Sometimes it granted him remarkable insight into a potential advantage, or a potential danger. Since the strange death of the auguring bird and the passing of the old woman, Baron Tourmont had been uneasy. Outsiders had come into his domain. He still believed in his heart that the strangers must be mercies, hired guns from outside the Bill, maybe from the north or farther east.
Brought in by that snowball. Son of a bitch. How was I to guess they could afford it? believe in them what lived in previous years. They used it to hire blasters.
Now the jolt was cartwheeling through the ridges of his skull. He lay flat on the floor, which was the only safe place to be after snorting several lines of jolt. His eyes were open, staring wide and blind, his hands so contracted the nails drew half-moons of blood from his pale palms.
10,000 dwarves.
He was in the bayous, naked and alone, beneath a sky that was slashed with green clouds. The mud rose to his groin. He tried to run, but without his prosthetic aids, he kept falling. His face was vanishing beneath warm, clinging mud that filled his ears and nose and eyes and open mouth. He tried to scream, but the slime choked him. Someone was pursuing him, someone who always dodged aside when the Baron tried to look behind him into the gathering darkness. As he rose from the wallowing sludge, he glanced down, saw that his penis was covered with big, scaly leeches, drawing a million specks of bright blood that dappled his thighs and matted in his pubic hair. On the floor of the best western snowy egret, the huge man arched his back. Open-mouthed, he silently screamed his terror. Sweat burst from his forehead. Sweat soaked his shirt. The person behind him was approaching. He could almost feel his hot breath on his naked back. As his pursuer pushed through, struggling toward what? The jolt was bringing him to a violent mental climax. The vision was nearly there, as he'd hoped. The truth about the strangers might be shown to him in a moment of vivid revelation. He was exhausted, his whole body now coated with the blood-sucking leeches. The experience was so appalling that he wanted to fall to his knees and vomit, but then he might get caught by what was closing in on him. It was near. The set guards outside the suite heard the moaning and panting.
That was
door.
Cabbage Hill.
They prayed he would not call for them.